Y'all sounded great. I hope you can do that maybe as our benediction. Or yes, that's succinctly. Very well received. Thank you. It's good to be with you all. No matter how many are here, it's good to be here. When I was a youth pastor, one of the things I wouldn't do when I first started out, have I shared this? I don't know. But when I first started out, we would probably have 2 to 3 kids. We would do Sunday evening youth group, and boy, it was just, bare bones, I can remember showing I would do all this planning, I would do all this work, and the last thing I wanted to say to these 2 that showed up, was, where are the others? So I just wouldn't do it. I wouldn't say, where are the others? And I just want you to know, church, that you are enough. Right here, this number, this room, these people, your faces, your hearts, you are enough. And we're enough. And I wanted that to be a message in my youth ministry. And I want it to be a message here. We don't have to do more. Be more. You right here are enough. I want to look at the message of Galatians today. It's the fruits of the Spirit. It's the fruits of the Spirit. I mean, the fruit of the Spirit. How can you not want to look at the fruit of the Spirit? And so I want to linger over kind of what Paul's doing in his argument, but then also looking at what that message means for us today. At first stop, Paul's metaphor of slavery can be kind of alarming, a little jarring as a reader. It certainly causes us to flinch as we read it. But if we can move past the metaphor, Paul's call in Galatians 5 is simply to freedom. It's the freedom to love. It's the freedom to work. It's the freedom to live in faith and community within the Spirit of God that indwells and moves in our midst and causes us to bear fruit, which is another metaphor that Paul uses. As we read in Galatians 5 today, it's important to understand a little bit more about its context. Paul's message, his use of the law, what is the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, his discussion of the Spirit and the flesh does not come up all by itself. In fact, Paul is responding to a group of missionaries, known not so affectionately as the super apostles. Now, they weren't called the super apostles then, but we sort of read in the past and realized what Paul was writing about. He was writing to what we now call the super apostles. What did these super apostles teach? Well, they taught that to practice faith in Christ, one must first accomplish the Jewish traditions of the circumcision for men, and then keeping the Jewish law and keeping kosher for families and for all others. For the super apostles, these elements of the Jewish tradition were the vehicles of God's Spirit and the evidence of real faith. That was not what Paul thought. For Paul, the Torah brought, according to Paul, a recognition of sin, not necessarily a freedom from it. And the evidence of the Spirit was not a marking of the flesh, but instead a fruit of the Spirit that would be born in us. And the vehicle for all of this is, well, Christ. In other words, it's a process, not a one-time transaction. It's a process. It's a process of becoming more gentle. It's a process of becoming more self-aware, more loving toward yourself and toward others, more patient with yourself and with others, more generous towards yourself and with others. And it's going to take some time and some work. So be kind to yourself in the process. Be gentle with yourself if you're not there. But the metaphor that Paul uses is that of what? Freedom. Freedom to make mistakes. Freedom to grow. Freedom to live and be yourself. Freedom to love and do as you do along the way with the Spirit. I'd like to share a story about a friend of mine who I really think captures this picture of a spirit alive and at work in unique ways. Bob McGee was the Episcopalian campus minister on the campus of Wake Forest University. Now, Wake Forest is consistently ranked in the top, 25, 10 of the regional schools. It's a very prestigious school in the South with stiff competition of students, and it's consistently ranked nationally. To give you an example, when I went there back in 2000, and I guess I went in 04, graduated in 07 from divinity school there, tuition at that time, mind you, just tuition, not including room and board, $47,682. Now, I didn't have to pay that, thankfully. I was there as a graduate student. One of the commitments that this seminary made was that all of their first, I think, 10 to 15 years worth of incoming students would actually be paid for. So I basically got off. I mean, not for free, I didn't have to pay and do some books and everything, but otherwise, it was a pretty good deal. So when I first arrived on campus in 2004, needless to say, I was impressed. The quad that you walked out on, the student quad, was immaculate. It was surrounded by brick buildings that were almost eternal, like they had been standing there forever and would remain so to this day. It was a picture of scholarship and wealth and prestige, and I wasn't sure I belonged. That wasn't until I met Reverend Bob McGee, known as Father Bob. Father Bob was the student campus minister there for the Episcopalians, and I met him during student orientation. Now, just to give you an idea of the sort of context in which we met in a group in which first-year students had to come to select an internship. Each one of us had to do an internship, an assistantship that helped pay some of our tuition. Reverend Bob was one of those who had an assistantship. You could be a campus minister intern with Reverend Bob, among many others. And among this line of service projects and programs that these ministers and other social agencies vied for our attention, the name of the game was to impress. You wanted to bring out your good stuff. So the program representatives would share a story, data, and a little bit about the stipend that each one of us would receive. And when Reverend Bob took the stage, he was a little different. He was wearing a large brim cowboy hat, cowboy boots, and then a t-shirt. And in one hand was a wad of balloons, and the other was a pump. So he introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Father Bob," as he was pumping up a large balloon. "I'm the Episcopalian campus minister," he said. And as he began, he took one of the balloons and he began pumping it up and twisting it. The noise caught your attention. "I love balloon animals," he said. "Well, not really. I don't love balloon animals per se," he said, "but I love the way children smile when I make them. I love the fact that college students think that they're too old for balloon animals. I love that they're silly and they remind me of the simple things." By the time he had finished, he had twisted the balloons into a cowboy hat that he then shared with one of the students. And it put everyone at ease. I liked him immediately. There in the halls of the academy, on a campus of prestige, was a man making balloon animals for graduate students. Are you ever really so important that you can't receive a balloon animal? I decided no. And then he spoke, and I want you to hear this part as part of our message today. He said, "Right now you all may be worried. Worried about what God has for you, what you should do, where you should go, what the right internship is, the right career, the right spouse, the right next choice. But I want you to know that there's a freedom in faith. This is not a restrictive faith. So find what you love, enjoy what you do." He said, "I love balloon animals, for instance. If you love children, teach them as an act of loving your neighbor. If you love books, then read them. Study them. Help others understand them. And if you can't find anything to love, give yourself time and start by acting lovingly toward yourself.
Now, I didn't end up pursuing an internship with Reverend Bob, but I did end up relying on him from time to time. He was a trusted friend throughout my 3 years of seminary. Looking back at the Galatians and Paul's letter, how will the Galatians know that they are indeed a people patterned after Christ? That they are indeed a people in Christ that are being changed day by day? If it's not an act of the flesh, if it's not by diet, and if it's not by the law, what is it? Well, first of all, Paul gives boundaries. He says, now don't get caught up in anything too terrible. Here are the boundaries. He said, don't go after greed, orgies, self-indulgence, rage, drunkenness, jealousy, the biggies, you know. But instead, serve one another in love. As Christ has loved, let that love be the change agent in you. This is known as the work of the Spirit, and it's a work that produces not marks of the flesh, but marks of the Spirit. In other words, it's a process. So take your time. And rest assured that as you have grace for yourself and for others, that the Spirit can move. Now, the irony of Paul's understanding of the law, which he seemingly dismantles, the law, as Paul would write, is good for what? Us noticing our own failure, as a measuring rod, as if it were. But then he offers this, that somehow by participating in the life of the Spirit, that then bears fruit in us, like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, generosity, self-control, that you will, in a very real sense, practice the principle of the law, the intention of the law, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. So, what do you look for in this freedom of faith? Well, you have some boundaries listed above. Don't do some things. But then otherwise, look around. Do whatever you do with an increasing sense of love, with an increasing sense of generosity, with an increasing sense of peace and patience, and the list goes on and on. And if you can't find joy or peace where you are, don't linger too long. And if you can't find joy or peace with whom you are, or with whomever you're with, don't linger too long. So back to Father Bob. Bob passed away in September of 2014. I don't know the cause, but it surprised many of us in the community. Bob was only 64 years old at the time of his passing. Describing his life and legacy, his obituary read as follows. He is and always will be Father Bob to the hundreds of students whose lives he touched. Bob wore a lot of hats. His hobby was entertaining children who knew him as Mr. Balloon Man, Roscoe the Clown, and Santa Claus. He was the proud owner of the Rector Brothers Flying Flea Circus, which he would pull out from time to time. Bob was a master of the art of making balloon animals, and he took his talents to Israel, where children in a school in Ibelin knew him as Abuna Balloon. A favorite hat Bob wore was his cowboy hat. For many years, he spent weeks in the summers at ranches in Wyoming and Montana, and was inspired by the at one with nature teachings of Native American spirituality. So friends, there is freedom in Christ. There is freedom to love, to be who you are, to be where you are, and to practice the fruits of the Spirit, and to let them blossom and grow. So let me offer you a blessing as a closing. Whatever you do, wherever you are, whether you are a realtor, retiree, counselor, CPE supervisor, musician, pianist, mother, father, engineer, student, medical engineer, IT analyst, public health servant, attorney, professor, graduate student, or anything else. Be who you are, and walk in the freedom that calls you where you are, as you are, to love, and to practice patience, and to practice generosity, and to practice peacemaking as you are able. There, where you are, be blessed. May God's Spirit be at work in you, and may you know that like all good things, it's a process.